Brace yourself for the unimaginable. In a secluded cabin, an old man and his pet raven stumbled upon something so horrifying it shook the small town to its core and challenged justice to unravel a perfect crime. Elias felt a shiver run down his spine. A dark premonition Corvus seemed to share. The raven, perched on his shoulder, let out a low, restless croak, its feathers ruffled. Its black eyes fixed on the darkness inside the cabin. The door, creaking like an ancient lament, opened to reveal a single, dusty, desolate room. The faint twilight barely pierced the grimy windows, casting dancing shadows that seemed to conceal secrets. "Easy, Corvus," Elias murmured, his voice hoarse, more to himself than to the bird. But Corvus didn't calm down. On the contrary, he leapt from Elias's shoulder and flew to the center of the room, landing on the wooden floor. He began to peck frantically at a specific spot, letting out sharp, insistent croaks. Elias, his heart pounding in his chest, approached. The wood there seemed a little darker, and there was a strange smell in the air, something metallic and earthy, which Elias couldn't immediately identify, but which caused him deep unease. The raven continued to peck, now with more force, as if trying to unearth something. Curious and apprehensive, Elias knelt, feeling the weight of his 70 years in his knees. He examined the spot where Corvus was so fixated. The floorboards seemed slightly loose, and one of them, in particular, had a dark, dried stain, almost imperceptible in the gloom, but which now, under Elias's careful gaze, appeared sinister. With an effort, he managed to lift the board. What he saw beneath wasn't a body, but something that chilled his blood in a far more insidious way. There was disturbed earth, a crudely dug hole, and at the bottom, wrapped in a piece of old, dirty canvas, something with the unmistakable shape of a human body. The smell, subtle before, now rose in waves, heavy and nauseating. It wasn't the smell of advanced decomposition, but rather of something that had been recently hidden, hastily and desperately. There was also a rusty garden spade, tossed aside, and some dark stains on the canvas that Elias didn't want to identify. A scream caught in Elias's throat. He recoiled sharply, stumbling over himself, his face pale and eyes wide. Corvus, sensing the change in his companion, flew back to Elias's shoulder, rubbing his head against his cheek, as if trying to comfort him, or perhaps share his own horror. "My God," Elias managed to whisper, his voice choked. He looked at the darkness beneath the floorboards, at the canvas that promised a macabre secret, and then at the raven, which seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. He didn't know how long he stood there, paralyzed by shock. The sun had already set completely when he finally managed to move, his limbs heavy and trembling. He pulled his cell phone from his pocket, his hands shaking so much he could barely dial. "Emergency," he managed to say to the voice on the other end of the line, his voice almost inaudible. I found something in the old miller's cabin. I think there's a body hidden here." The initial disbelief in the operator's voice was palpable. "Sir, are you sure? It's a remote area." "I'm sure," Elias insisted, his voice gaining strength with indignation and fear. "My raven showed me. There's a hole in the ground and a canvas. And the smell." In less than an hour, the flashing blue and red lights of the police tore through the darkness of the forest. The small town of Oakhaven, known for its tranquility and for not having a serious crime in decades, was shaken to its foundations. The cabin, once a forgotten place, became the center of a macabre investigation. Elias, sitting in a patrol car, with Corvus nestled in his lap, watched the frenzy. The night silence was broken by radios, voices, and the sound of shovels at work. The truth was beginning to be unearthed, and with it, Oakhaven's peace would be buried forever. The police strobe lights danced among the trees, painting the forest with a ghostly glow. The night silence once broken only by the sounds of nature, was now invaded by hurried voices, the rustle of uniforms, and the crackle of radios. Elias, still sitting in the patrol car, with Corvus nestled in his lap, felt the night's chill penetrate his bones, but it was the shock that kept him trembling. A middle-aged detective with a tired face and stubble opened the patrol car door. "Mr. Elias, I'm Detective Miller. We need you to tell us everything again, with more details." Elias nodded, his throat dry. "I already told you. I was with Corvus, exploring the cabin. He showed me." He gestured vaguely towards the raven, which let out a soft croak. Detective Miller cast a skeptical glance at the bird, but didn't comment. "I see. And what exactly did you see when you lifted the board?" Elias closed his eyes for an instant. The image of the canvas and disturbed earth seared into his mind. Earth, a lot of earth. And the canvas, it had the shape of a body. And the smell, Detective, the smell was unmistakable. It wasn't animal. "Our team confirmed it," Miller said, his voice graver. "It's a human body. The medical examiner is on the way. It seems you and your friend have made a terrible discovery, Mr. Elias." The news spread through Oakhaven like wildfire. The next morning, the buzz was palpable. Conversations in coffee shops and on the streets ceased, replaced by anxious whispers. Who was the victim? Who would do something so heinous in their quiet town? Miller's cabin, once a forgotten landmark, was now the epicenter of a tragedy. Elias was taken to the police station to give a formal statement. He described every detail, from Corvus's restless behavior to the moment he lifted the board. The part about the raven showing the spot was met with a mix of curiosity and disbelief, but the physical evidence was irrefutable. Corvus patiently waited for Elias in an improvised cage in the waiting room, under the fascinated gaze of some police officers. "I've never seen anything like it," commented Sergeant Ramirez, a practical woman of few words, as she watched Elias leave the interrogation room, accompanied by Corvus, a raven, pointing out a body. "It's like something out of a movie." Detective Miller rubbed his forehead. "It is what it is. The body was there, and Mr. Elias found it exactly where the raven was pecking. We can't ignore the facts, no matter how strange they are." The victim's identity was quickly confirmed. Sarah Jenkins, a young woman who had disappeared almost a year ago. She had moved to Oakhaven, seeking tranquility, but found a brutal end. The news shocked the community even more, as Sarah was known for her kindness and for having few enemies. The investigation deepened. The cabin was thoroughly searched, every inch examined. The rusty garden spade was collected as evidence, as were soil samples and canvas fibers. Oakhaven, which prided itself on its absence of serious crimes, now faced the harsh reality of a murder and concealment of a body. Days turned into weeks. The police worked tirelessly, following leads, interviewing Sarah's neighbors and friends. Community pressure was immense. Everyone wanted answers, wanted justice. And then the bombshell dropped. An enigmatic woman new to town and with a shadowy past was arrested. Her name was Ilara Vance. She had no obvious ties to Sarah Jenkins, but the police found circumstantial evidence linking her to the cabin and, in some way, to the crime. The formal charge was concealment of a body. The murder itself was still under investigation, but the concealment was the first step. News of Ilara Vance's arrest divided Oakhaven. Some saw her as the monster who had desecrated the town's peace. Others, especially those who barely knew her, wondered if the police had acted in haste, seeking a scapegoat to appease the community's fury. Elias, watching everything from his porch, with Corvus perched on his shoulder, felt a weight in his heart. He had unearthed the truth, but what came next seemed even darker. Oakhaven's peace was irrevocably broken. Ilara Vance's trial promised to be a spectacle, and Elias knew that he and his raven in some way would be at its center. Justice in Oakhaven was about to be tested in a way no one had ever imagined. The small town, once a refuge of tranquility, now buzzed with anxiety and anticipation of what the court would reveal. Ilara Vance, a woman with deep eyes and a disturbing stillness, remained silent throughout the interrogation, offering little information that could clarify her presence near the cabin or her possible connection to Sarah Jenkins. The police had found traces of her footprints near the property days after Sarah's disappearance, and a garden tool similar to the one found in the cabin had been seen in her possession. Circumstantial evidence, yes, but enough for the charge of concealment of a body. Sarah Jenkins' murder, however, remained a mystery without a clear perpetrator. To defend Ilara, Sofia Almeida was assigned a freshly graduated public defender with the inexperience of someone fresh out of law school. Her eyes, though young, carried a mix of idealism and a latent fear of the responsibility thrust upon her. She knew this case could define her career or destroy it. Sitting in her small office, piles of documents scattered across the desk, Sofia tried to find a loophole, a reasonable doubt in the narrative the prosecution was building. "It's a tough case, Sofia," her mentor, an older, cynical lawyer, had warned. "The town wants a culprit, and Ilara Vance, with her reserved manner, fits the role of mysterious stranger perfectly." Sofia had visited Ilara in prison. The woman, despite the gravity of the situation, seemed strangely distant, almost apathetic. "I didn't do it," Ilara had said, her voice low and emotionless, but without offering any alternative or convincing alibi. "I didn't know Sarah Jenkins." The prosecution, led by prosecutor Arthur Hayes, an ambitious man with a history of victories, was confident. The discovery of the body by Elias and Corvus, though unusual, was irrefutable proof of concealment. Ilara's connection to the cabin, however tenuous, was the piece they needed to close the concealment case. The murder, they argued, would be investigated separately, but the concealment was a crime in itself. Elias, in turn, felt increasingly involved. He was the key witness, the man who, with the help of his raven, had revealed the cabin's secret. Local media attention was suffocating. Reporters camped near his house, seeking a new statement, a new perspective on the detective raven. Corvus, oblivious to the fame, continued to perch on his shoulder, observing the world with his black, intelligent eyes. Elias, however, felt the weight of expectation. He had told his story countless times, but the part about Corvus was always met with skepticism, even if the physical evidence confirmed his discovery. "They don't understand Corvus," Elias murmured to the bird as he leafed through the local newspaper with the headline, "The Oakhaven Mystery." "They want a logical explanation, but the truth isn't always logical." The trial date was set. The judge, Helena Vargas, was known for her unyielding demeanor and her aversion to circumlocution. She tolerated no digressions and demanded concrete evidence. Sofia knew she would have to be impeccable. The prosecution would present a mountain of circumstantial evidence, and the community, thirsty for justice, would be watching every move. The Oakhaven Courthouse, an old red-brick building, was about to become the stage for a drama that would shake the town's foundations. The tension was palpable. Whispered conversations in the streets turned into heated debates. The question hanging in the air was Ilara Vance truly the culprit, or merely a victim of circumstances and Oakhaven's need to find a scapegoat? Sofia Almeida took a deep breath. Looking at the pile of papers on her desk, she knew she needed something more, something that could turn the tide. But what? All conventional evidence seemed to point to her client's guilt. The last hope, a thin thread of possibility, seemed to rest on something that logic and law could hardly accept, the uncanny intelligence of a raven. But how could she even think of presenting something so extraordinary in a courtroom? The trial was about to begin, and Sophia felt the weight of the world on her shoulders. But what? The morning air in Oakhaven was heavy, not with the fresh forest breeze, but with a dense, almost suffocating expectation. The courthouse, a red brick building that had witnessed generations of minor disputes and petty crimes, had never attracted so much attention. Reporters from neighboring towns and even the state capital gathered out front, their cameras and microphones pointed at the main door, awaiting the arrival of the protagonists of the drama that would unfold inside. Sophia Almeida felt her stomach churn as she parked her modest car a few blocks away to avoid the commotion. The suit she wore felt too tight, an uncomfortable armor for the battle ahead. She mentally reviewed the few weaknesses she had found in the accusation. The absence of a clear motive, the lack of direct witnesses, but the mountain of circumstantial evidence seemed insurmountable. As she approached the side entrance for lawyers, she could hear the crowd's murmur, their thirst for answers, for a culprit. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was even more oppressive. The benches were packed. Curious faces, some stern, others distressed, filled every seat. In the center, Ilara Vance was already seated at the defense table, flanked by a police officer. Her posture was straight, her deep eyes scanning the room with a stillness Sophia found unsettling. There was no evident fear, no anger, just an almost ethereal resignation. Sophia sat beside her, feeling the gaze of hundreds of people upon her. "Good morning, Ilara," Sophia whispered, her voice a little hoarse. Ilara merely nodded, an almost imperceptible movement. "Are you ready?" Sophia took a deep breath. "As ready as I can be." Moments later, a murmur rippled through the room. Elias entered, his gait a little slower than usual, but his dignity intact. On his shoulder, Corvus was perched, his black shining eyes observing the crowd with an almost human curiosity. The Raven was as central a figure as any other in that trial, and its presence caused a mix of fascination and discomfort. Elias sat in the front benches, a spot reserved for witnesses, and Corvus tilted his head, as if assessing each face in the room. The side door opened again, and Judge Helena Vargas entered, her dark robe fluttering with her movement. The room immediately fell silent. Judge Vargas was a middle-aged woman with impeccably pinned gray hair and a gaze that brooked no argument. She sat in her elevated seat, striking her gavel once. "All rise," announced the bailiff. When everyone was seated again, Judge Vargas began, her voice clear and authoritative. "We are here today for the case of the state of Oakhaven versus Ilara Vance, accused of concealment of a body. This court will seek the truth based on the evidence presented. I will not tolerate interruptions or displays of emotion. Order will be maintained at all costs." Her eyes swept the room, pausing for an instant on Ilara, then on Sophia, and finally on Elias and Corvus. Prosecutor Arthur Hayes rose for his opening statement. He was an imposing man with a resonant voice and unwavering confidence. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, gesturing dramatically. "Weeks ago, the peace of our beloved Oakhaven was shattered by the discovery of a heinous crime. Sarah Jenkins, one of our neighbors, was brutally murdered, and her body, hidden with cruelty and disrespect, was found in the abandoned cabin in the forest. The proof of concealment is irrefutable, and the defendant, Ilara Vance's connection to this act is clear." Hayes continued, detailing Ilara's footprints near the cabin, the garden tool in her possession, her reserved demeanor, and the absence of an alibi. He painted a grim picture of a mysterious woman who had arrived in town and become involved in a terrible crime. The defendant tried to erase the traces of a murder, but the truth, as always, finds its way. And today, the truth will be revealed in this courtroom. He concluded with a flourish, his eyes fixed on the jury. Sophia felt a knot in her throat. Hayes's narrative was powerful, convincing, It was the story the town wanted to hear. It was the story the media had already written. She stood up, her legs a little shaky. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Sophia began, her voice softer, but with an almost imperceptible tremor. "The prosecution has presented a story based on circumstances, on assumptions. My client, Ilara Vance, is accused of concealment of a body. But where is the direct evidence? Where is the motive? Where is the confession? What the prosecution cannot prove is that Ilara Vance committed this crime. They don't have a murderer, so they seek a scapegoat for the concealment. I ask you to keep an open mind, to look beyond appearances and convenient narratives. The truth is more complex than it seems, and what appears obvious is not always what truly happened." Sophia sat down, feeling the weight of the silence that followed. Her statement seemed weak compared to Hayes's. She looked at Ilara, who remained impassive. Judge Vargas nodded, and the first witness was called. The trial was officially underway, and Sophia knew that the battle for truth and for her client's life had just begun. The tension in the room was almost palpable, a foreboding of the difficult days to come. The bailiff called the name Detective Ricardo Silva. A corpulent man with a neatly trimmed mustache and a serious demeanor walked to the witness stand. He was the first officer to arrive at the cabin after Elias's call. Prosecutor Hayes began his interrogation with a series of direct questions, establishing the chain of custody for the evidence and the crime scene. "Detective Silva, could you describe what you found in the abandoned cabin on May 15th? "Yes, sir. Upon arrival, Mr. Elias and his raven were waiting. I was directed to a specific area on the dirt floor of the cabin. There was a pile of dry leaves and debris that appeared to have been unnaturally accumulated. Beneath that pile, we found a human body in an advanced state of decomposition, covered by an old canvas and some branches." Hayes displayed photographs of the scene, which were passed to the jury. Sophia observed the jurors' faces, some wrinkled in revulsion, others fixed with morbid curiosity. Ilara, beside her, showed no reaction. "And what else was found in the cabin, Detective?" Hayes continued. "Near where the body was hidden, we found traces of disturbed earth and a garden spade, which appeared to have been recently used. There were also footprints in the damp soil around the cabin, which were cast and later compared." "And those footprints, Detective Silva, were they compared to any person of interest?" "Yes, sir. The footprints were consistent with the size and tread pattern of the defendant, Ilara Vance, who lived in the vicinity of the cabin." Sophia felt a chill. It was the strongest circumstantial evidence against Ilara. "Thank you, Detective," Hayes concluded with a satisfied smile. "Your witness, Ms. Almeida." Sophia stood up, her hands sweating slightly. "Detective Silva," she began, her voice trying to sound firm. "You mentioned a garden spade. Were there any fingerprints on it?" "The spade was covered in dirt, and no clear fingerprints could be obtained. And the footprints, you said they were consistent with my client's footwear. Does that mean they were identical, or just that the size and shape were similar?" "It means they were compatible. We cannot state with 100% certainty that they were made by the defendant, but the probability is high, given the proximity of her residence and the shoe size." "So, there's no irrefutable proof that the footprints belong to my client, correct?" "There's no positive identification through fingerprints or DNA, but the compatibility is a strong indication." "And the cabin, Detective, is it a frequent thoroughfare for residents of the area?" "Yes, it's a forest area with trails, although the cabin itself is more isolated." "Thank you, Detective Silva." Sophia sat down, feeling she had managed to scratch the surface, but not enough to dismantle the accusation. The prosecution called a few more witnesses. A forensic expert who confirmed Sarah Jenkins's cause of death, asphyxiation, although the murder was not the focus of the trial, and the approximate date of concealment. and a neighbor who had seen Ilara walking near the forest on days close to the discovery. Each witness added a layer to the web of circumstantial evidence. Finally, Prosecutor Hayes called the witness everyone was waiting for. The state calls Elias Thorne. Elias walked slowly to the witness stand, with Corvus perched on his shoulder. A murmur rippled through the room, and Judge Vargas had to bang her gavel to restore order. Corvus, oblivious to the commotion, observed the room with his curious eyes. Elias took the oath, his voice hoarse but clear. Hayes began, "Mr. Thorne, could you recount what happened on May 15th when you and your raven made the discovery at the cabin?" Elias narrated the story he had told countless times. The walk in the forest, Corvus acting unusually, the bird's insistence on leading him to the cabin, the sound of Corvus scratching the ground, and finally, the horrific discovery. "And are you certain it was your raven that directed you to the exact spot where the body was hidden?" Hayes asked, with a tone bordering on skepticism, even though Elias was his own witness. "Absolutely," Elias replied, looking at Corvus, who tilted his head. "He showed me the way. He knew something was wrong." "And you had no prior knowledge that there was a body there?" "No, sir, never." Hayes nodded, turning to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, the witness, with the help of his pet, found the body. The concealment is a fact. Now, it is up to us to determine who was responsible for this vile act," he concluded, letting the implication hang in the air. Sophia felt the weight of responsibility. Elias's story was moving, but the part about Corvus was a double-edged sword. She knew she needed to be careful. "Mr. Thorne," Sophia began her cross-examination, "you and Corvus have a special bond, don't you?" "Yes, ma'am. He's more than a pet. He's my family." "And you believe Corvus has an intelligence beyond the ordinary?" Hayes stood up. "Objection, Your Honor. Irrelevant and speculative." "Sustained," Judge Vargas said with a stern look at Sophia. "Stick to the facts, Ms. Almeida." Sophia swallowed hard. "Mr. Thorne, you testified that Corvus scratched the ground. Has he done that before, on other occasions, without anything being hidden?" Elias thought for a moment. "He's a raven. He likes to investigate, but never with the intensity and persistence he showed that day. It was different." "I see. And can you state with certainty that the raven was pointing to the body and not just acting out of an animal's natural curiosity?" Elias looked at Corvus, then at Sophia, his eyes conveying an unwavering conviction. "I know what I saw. He was showing me. He led me there." Sophia nodded. No further questions. She knew she couldn't discredit Elias, as he was the witness to the discovery. But the mention of Corvus's intelligence, however briefly, had been planted. The prosecution had established the concealment and Ilara's circumstantial link. Sophia's challenge was immense. The trial had barely begun, and the noose was already tightening around her client's neck. Prosecutor Hayes rose for his redirect examination of Elias with a confident smile. "Mr. Thorne, to clarify, despite any natural curiosity of a raven, are you absolutely certain that Corvus led you directly to the spot where the body was hidden without any doubt or hesitation on your part?" Elias looked at Corvus, who was nestled on his shoulder, and then at Hayes. "Yes, sir, he showed me. There is no doubt in my mind." Hayes nodded, satisfied. "Thank you, Mr. Thorne. No further questions." Elias stepped down from the witness stand, with Corvus still on his shoulder, and walked towards the exit, under everyone's watchful eye. Judge Vargas observed the scene with a neutral expression, but her eyes seemed to follow the raven for an instant. "The prosecution rests, Your Honor," Hayes declared, his voice resonating with the confidence of someone who believes they have presented an irrefutable case. Sophia felt a chill run down her spine. It was her turn. The prosecution had built a web of circumstantial evidence that, though lacking a smoking gun, seemed to suffocate Ilara, Footprints, a spade, her reserved demeanor, the absence of an alibi. Everything fit Hayes's narrative. Judge Vargas turned to Sophia. "Ms. Almeida, is the defense ready to present its case?" Sophia stood up, her hands sweating. She had few cards left to play. Ilara was a woman who had recently arrived in town, with no deep ties, no close friends who could testify on her behalf. Her enigmatic nature, which Sophia hoped could be seen as innocence, was being interpreted as guilt. "Yes, Your Honor," Sophia replied, her voice a little firmer than she expected. "The defense chooses not to call witnesses at this time. We contend that the prosecution has failed to present direct evidence linking my client, Ilara Vance, to the act of concealment of a body. The evidence presented is purely circumstantial, based on assumptions and interpretations that do not withstand closer scrutiny." She paused, looking at the jury. "There are no fingerprints from Ilara on the spade. The footprints are merely compatible, not a positive identification. No motive has been presented, no link between Ilara Vance and the deceased Sarah Jenkins. What the prosecution has presented is a convenient story, but not irrefutable proof of guilt. I ask the jury to consider the absence of direct evidence and the existence of reasonable doubt." Sophia knew it was a weak argument, almost desperate. She was counting on the jury's intelligence to see the gaps, but Hayes's narrative was so powerful, so emotionally charged, that it was difficult to combat with only the cold logic of absent evidence. Judge Vargas listened intently, without showing any emotion. When Sophia finished, the judge nodded. "The defense rests, then?" "Yes, Your Honor," Sophia confirmed, feeling the weight of impending defeat. A heavy silence hung over the room. Prosecutor Hayes had a small smile on his lips, a sign of his confidence. The jurors in turn seemed confused, some with skeptical glances directed at Ilara, who remained motionless, an enigma even to her own lawyer. "Very well," Judge Vargas declared, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "With the presentation of the prosecution's and defense's cases concluded, we will now proceed to closing arguments. Prosecutor Hayes, you may begin tomorrow morning. The court is adjourned for today." The gavel struck, a dry and final sound. Sophia felt a knot in her stomach. She had tried, but conventional evidence had failed. The noose was tighter than ever, and Ilara Vance's life hung by a thread. The truth, she realized with a chill, would need more than legal arguments to be revealed. It would need something extraordinary. Judge Vargas, with her impenetrable expression, rose and left the room, followed by her assistants. The murmur that followed was subdued, but palpable. The jurors began to disperse, some casting curious glances at Ilara, others at Sophia, as if trying to decipher the enigma of that trial. Sophia remained standing for a moment, feeling the weight of impending failure. Hayes, with his victorious smile, approached her. "A bold move, Ms. Almeida," he said, his voice laced with irony, "or perhaps just desperate." Sophia turned to him, her eyes flashing. "The absence of direct evidence is a fact, prosecutor, and the truth always finds a way." Hayes merely chuckled, a low, confident sound. "We'll see. Tomorrow, the truth will be the verdict." He walked away, leaving Sophia with a bitter taste in her mouth. She approached Ilara, who was still seated as motionless as a statue. "Ilara, are you all right?" The enigmatic woman raised her eyes, and Sophia saw a flicker of something she couldn't identify, perhaps resignation, perhaps a disturbing calm. "I am. You did what you could." Her voice was a whisper, but laden with an acceptance that made Sophia feel even worse. "I'm so sorry, Ilara. I don't know what else we can do. The circumstantial evidence is strong, and without an alibi or a witness, it's very difficult." Sophia felt her throat tighten. She was a rookie lawyer, and the pressure of that case was overwhelming. Ilara merely nodded without further words. She stood up and was escorted out of the room, her slender figure disappearing down the corridor. Sophia picked up her briefcase, the papers inside seeming useless now. She left the courthouse. The late afternoon light, filtering through the corridor windows, tinging the marble with a melancholic orange. The city outside continued its rhythm, oblivious to the drama unfolding within those walls. She sat on an empty bench, her head in her hands. She had reviewed every detail, every testimony. Detective Silva had no fingerprints. The footprints were only compatible. No link between Ilara and the victim. No motive. But the absence of direct evidence was not the same as proof of innocence, especially when the prosecution had built such a compelling narrative with the pieces it had. The story of Elias Thorne and Corvus, the macabre discovery, the garden spade, the cabin's proximity to Ilara's house, the defendant's reclusive behavior, all of this, woven together by Hayes, formed a picture that for a jury could be more than enough. The emotion of the discovery, the gravity of the crime, the need for justice, all of it played against Ilara. Sophia closed her eyes, trying to ward off the feeling of powerlessness. She had relied on logic, on the absence of irrefutable evidence. But the law wasn't always logical. Sometimes it was about the best told story, the most compelling emotion, and Hayes was a master of that. She thought of Corvus, Elias's raven, that animal that had pointed to the body. Elias had an unwavering conviction about the bird's intelligence. Sophia had tried to use that to question the credibility of the raven's guidance, but the judge had cut her off. But what if Corvus's intelligence wasn't a weakness, but the only strength, the only hope? Tomorrow would be the closing arguments. Sophia stood up, her mind buzzing. She needed Elias. She needed Corvus. She needed a plan that seemed impossible, but which deep down was Ilara's only chance. She knew Judge Vargas would never allow an animal as a witness, but perhaps there was another way. A demonstration, a visual proof. She picked up her cell phone, her hands trembling slightly. "Elias," she murmured, dialing the number. "I need your help. And Corvus." The truth, she realized with a chill, would need more than legal arguments to be revealed, and she was willing to risk everything to find it. Night fell over the city, but for Sophia, time seemed to stand still. Sitting in her small office, lit only by the cold glow of the computer screen, she tried to give form to the idea that consumed her. The call to Elias had been an impulse, a desperate plea. Now she needed a concrete plan, something she could present to Judge Vargas without being immediately ridiculed and dismissed. "A raven as evidence," she murmured to herself, her voice hoarse with fatigue. It seemed insane, but the premise of the story was clear. Corvus had pointed out the body. If he could replicate that somehow, in court, perhaps that could break Hayes's narrative. She opened a browser and began searching for detailed maps of the forest region, focusing on the cabin area. She needed something large, clear, with visible landmarks. She printed several versions, spreading them across the table, her eyes fixed on the green and brown contours, the cabin, the creek, the trails. Where exactly had Corvus pointed? Elias had described the location precisely, but the raven's visual memory was the key. Half an hour later, Sophia was knocking on Elias Thorne's door. The old man opened it, his face etched with worry, but with a glimmer of expectation in his eyes. Corvus was perched on Elias's shoulder, observing Sophia with his penetrating intelligence. "Good evening, Ms. Almeida," Elias greeted, his voice soft. "Come in. Corvus and I were waiting." Sophia entered, smelling the wood and earth that seemed to permeate Elias's home. She placed her briefcase on the kitchen table, taking out the maps. "Elias, I know this will sound crazy, but we have no other options. Prosecutor Hayes has built a strong case with the circumstantial evidence. We need something that changes everything." Elias nodded, his eyes fixed on the maps. "What do you have in mind?" "Corvus," Sophia began, looking at the bird. "He was the one who found the body. He knew where it was. If he could show us that again on a map in court, that would prove Ilara had no way of knowing, that the discovery was Corvus's, not hers." Elias frowned. "They'll never allow that, Ms. Almeida. An animal as a witness." "Not as a witness," Sophia corrected, her voice gaining strength. "As a demonstration, a piece of visual evidence. I would argue that Corvus's intelligence is a fact, already established by your own testimony, Elias, and that his ability to identify the discovery site is crucial to uncovering the truth about who really knew about the concealment." Corvus let out a low croak, as if understanding the gravity of the conversation. "Do you think he can do it?" Sophia asked, hope and desperation mixed in her voice. "Point to the exact spot on the map." Elias smiled, a small, proud smile. "Corvus is smarter than most people, Ms. Almeida. He remembers everything, where the body was, where the spade was. He remembers the sequence of events. He's a born observer." He took one of Sophia's maps, one that clearly showed the cabin and the surrounding area. He placed it on the table. "Corvus," he said, his voice calm and encouraging, "show Ms. Almeida. Where was the cabin's secret?" Old Corvus tilted his head, his black eyes gleaming. He leaped from Elias's shoulder to the table, walking with decisive steps across the map. Sophia held her breath. The raven stopped, hesitated for a long second, which felt like an eternity. Then, with a precise movement of his beak, he touched a specific spot on the map, a little away from the cabin, where the earth had been disturbed. Sophia felt a shiver run down her spine. It was the spot, the exact spot Elias had described in his testimony. "He did it," she whispered, a wave of relief and disbelief washing over her. "He really did." Elias stroked Corvus's head. "I told you. He knows." Hope, once a thin thread, now transformed into a strong rope. Sophia knew the battle to convince the judge would be monumental. Hayes would do everything to stop it, but now she had something extraordinary. "Elias," Sophia said, gathering the maps and her cell phone, "you and Corvus need to be in court tomorrow, earlier than usual. We need to prepare for the fight of our lives." She left Elias's house with renewed determination. The night was still young, and she had much to plan. The truth, she realized, would not be revealed by conventional legal arguments, but by a raven and an old man's unwavering faith. Tomorrow, the court would witness something unprecedented. The next morning dawned grey, a pale reflection of the anxiety gnawing at Sophia. She arrived at the courthouse even before the sun could tint the sky pink, carrying her heavy briefcase and the carefully folded maps. Each step echoed in the empty corridor, a reminder of the solitude of her mission. The idea of presenting Corvus as a demonstration still seemed to border on the absurd, but it was the only card she had left. Elias and Corvus were already waiting for her in the lawyer's waiting room, a reserved and quiet corner. The old man sat calmly, with Corvus perched on his shoulder, the bird's black eyes fixed on the door, as if anticipating the drama to come. The raven's presence, even there, was a magnet for curious glances from the few staff members already circulating. "Good morning, Elias," Sophia said, her voice a little hoarse. "Is Corvus ready?" Elias smiled softly, stroking the bird's head. "He always is. He understands more than we imagine." Sophia nodded, feeling a pang of hope. She needed Corvus to understand. She needed him to be perfect. Shortly before 9, Judge Vargas entered the room. Her expression was, as always, austere, unshakable. Hayes was already in his seat, with a contained smile that Sophia interpreted as arrogance. The jurors had not yet been called. "Ms. Almeida," the judge began, her voice sharp, "I hope you have something substantial to present today. The court's time is precious." Sophia stood up, feeling her heart pound in her chest. "Yes, Your Honor. I have a formal request for the admission of new evidence, or rather, a crucial demonstration for the clarification of this case." Hayes raised an eyebrow, a glint of scorn in his eyes. "A demonstration? At this stage of the trial, Ms. Almeida, with the prosecution having already presented its case and the defense lacking a convincing alibi." "Prosecutor Hayes, please," the judge interjected, though her tone was not one of encouragement for Sophia. "Proceed, Ms. Almeida." Sophia took a deep breath. "Your Honor, the premise of this case lies in the discovery of the body by Elias Thorne and his raven Corvus. Prosecutor Hayes built his narrative around the idea that Ilara knew about the concealment and therefore is guilty. However, the only evidence of the body's initial location came from Corvus. My proposal is that Corvus, the original discoverer himself, demonstrate in court the exact spot where the body was hidden, using a detailed map of the area. A murmur rippled through the room, quickly silenced by the judge's gaze. Hayes burst out laughing. "Your Honor, this is an outrage, a circus. Ms. Almeida is trying to turn this courtroom into a zoo. An animal as a demonstration? This is completely unprecedented and inadmissible." "Objection, Your Honor," Sophia retorted, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. "I am not proposing Corvus as a witness, but as an instrument of evidence. Corvus's intelligence, his ability to remember and identify the discovery site, has already been established by Elias Thorne's testimony. This demonstration is not to prove Ilara's guilt or innocence, but to uncover the truth about how the body was discovered and, crucially, to refute the inference that Ilara had prior knowledge of the location. If Corvus can point to the spot, it proves that the discovery was his, a fortuitous event, and not the result of Ilara's prior knowledge." Judge Vargas pressed her lips together, her eyes scanning Sophia, then Hayes, and finally resting on the waiting room door, where Elias and Corvus awaited. The idea was indeed outrageous, but there was a subtle logic to Sophia's argument, a loophole that the law, in its pursuit of truth, perhaps could not entirely ignore. "Ms. Almeida," the judge said, her voice lower, but still laden with authority, "are you aware of the precedent this would set, and the possibility that this might be seen as a desperate attempt at emotional manipulation of the jury?" "I am aware, Your Honor," Sophia replied, maintaining eye contact. "But I am equally aware that my client's life is at stake. Without direct evidence linking Ilara to the crime, and with the prosecution building a purely circumstantial case, the truth about the original discovery is the only way to ensure a fair trial. Corvus's intelligence is a fact. His ability to point to the location is a fact. I ask the court to allow the truth to be revealed by unconventional means, if necessary." Hayes was visibly furious, but the judge raised her hand, silencing him. She deliberated for a long moment, the silence in the room becoming almost unbearable. Sophia felt sweat trickle down her back. It was all or nothing. Finally, Judge Vargas let out an almost imperceptible sigh. "Very well, Ms. Almeida. Although I consider this a highly questionable and unprecedented maneuver, the court recognizes the importance of exploring all avenues for the truth, especially in the absence of direct evidence. I will allow the demonstration. However," she added, her gaze stern, "any attempt to turn this into a spectacle will be immediately halted. Prosecutor Hayes will have the opportunity to question Mr. Thorne about Corvus's methodology and the nature of his training. Bring in the raven and the map, and let it be recorded that this court is not pleased with the situation." Sophia felt a knot in her throat unravel. A wave of relief washed over her, followed by an overwhelming surge of adrenaline. She had succeeded. The waiting room door opened, and Elias entered. Corvus perched on his shoulder, observing the court with his intelligent eyes. The murmur resumed, louder this time, but the judge did not silence it. All eyes were now fixed on the Raven. The stage was set. The truth, or the attempt to reach it, was about to take a form no one had ever imagined. Sophia felt the gaze of every person in the room. Judge Vargas, with her impenetrable expression. Hayes, with a sneer that barely disguised his fury. The jurors, some curious, others visibly skeptical, and some with a glint of astonishment. Elias, with a calm that contrasted with Sophia's emotional storm, walked to an auxiliary table that Sophia had requested to be placed in front of the jury. He placed Sophia's briefcase on the table, opening it to reveal the detailed map of the forest and the cabin. The map, printed in large format, showed the topography, the trails, and, crucially, the area around the cabin. "Your Honor," Sophia began, her voice trembling slightly, but gaining strength with each word. "With the court's permission, I present Mr. Elias Thorne and Corvus. Mr. Thorne will instruct Corvus to identify on the map the exact spot where the body was discovered. As per his previous testimony." Hayes rose abruptly. "Objection, Your Honor. This is a farce. The Raven could have been trained to touch any spot on the map. There's no way to verify the authenticity of this demonstration. It's pure manipulation." "Prosecutor Hayes," the judge interjected, her voice a warning, "your objection is noted. However, the court has already allowed the demonstration. Your opportunity to question the methodology will come. Proceed, Ms. Almeida." Sophia nodded, grateful for the judge's intervention. She turned to Elias, who had already unfolded the map on the table. Corvus leaped from Elias's shoulder to the edge of the table, his black eyes scanning the environment, seemingly oblivious to the tension surrounding him. "Corvus," Elias said, his voice soft but clear, echoing in the silence of the courtroom. He pointed to the map. "Show Ms. Almeida." The Raven tilted his head, his eyes fixed on the map. He took a hesitant step, then another, walking across the printed surface. Each movement was accompanied by fixed gazes. The jurors leaned forward, their expressions a mix of fascination and disbelief. The silence was so dense that Sophia could hear her own heart beating. Corvus stopped. He was over an area of the map representing the dense forest, a little away from the cabin structure. He hesitated for a long second, which felt like an eternity. If he made a mistake, if he did nothing, everything would be lost. Then, with a quick and precise movement, Corvus lowered his beak and touched a specific spot on the map. It was a small clearing, marked with a red X that Sophia had drawn for practice, but which now looked like a target. The exact spot where Elias had described the discovery of the shallow grave. A collective whisper swept through the room. A woman on the jury brought her hand to her mouth. Hayes paled, his sneer disappearing completely. Judge Vargas, for the first time, showed a hint of surprise in her eyes. Sophia felt a wave of euphoria and relief so intense that her legs almost gave way. He had done it. Corvus had done it. "Your Honor," Sophia said, her voice now firm and full of conviction, "let it be recorded that Corvus, the original discoverer, precisely pointed to the exact location of the body's concealment, as per Mr. Thorne's testimony. This demonstration proves that the discovery was a fortuitous event guided by an animal's intelligence and instinct, and not by any prior knowledge of my client, Ilara." Hayes composed himself, though he still seemed shaken. "Objection, Your Honor. This is still inadmissible. An animal cannot be an instrument of evidence without its actions being subject to questioning. How do we know it wasn't trained for this? How do we know it's not just reacting to a specific command from its owner without any real understanding of what it's doing?" "Prosecutor Hayes," Sophia countered. Corvus's intelligence and observational abilities have been established. Mr. Thorne gave no specific command other than, where was the cabin's secret? Corvus acted on his own memory and understanding. The precision of his action, Your Honor, speaks for itself. It is visual and undeniable proof of the nature of the discovery. Judge Vargas looked at the map, then at Corvus, who was now perched back on Elias's shoulder, observing the scene with an almost defiant calm. She struck her gavel, a dry sound that cut through the tension. The court acknowledges Corvus's demonstration, the judge declared, her voice still stern but with a tone of recognition. The relevance and interpretation of this demonstration will be subject to deliberation. Prosecutor Hayes, you will have the opportunity to question Mr. Thorne about Corvus's methodology and the nature of his training. However, the demonstration itself has been performed. Ms. Almeida, your evidence has been presented. Sophia nodded, feeling the weight of a battle won, but knowing the war was far from over. The seed of doubt had been planted in the jury. The truth had been revealed in a way no one expected. The courtroom would never be the same. The murmur in the room, which had subsided to a shocked whisper, now resumed with greater force. Judge Vargas struck her gavel again, restoring order. Prosecutor Hayes, the judge declared, her gaze fixed on the lawyer, who still seemed to struggle to regain his composure. Your turn. The court is ready for your inquiry. Hayes stood up, adjusting his robe. His face was red, but he forced a professional smile. Thank you, Your Honor. With the court's permission, I would like to call Mr. Elias Thorne to the witness stand. Elias, who was still beside the table with the map, Corvus perched on his shoulder, calmly walked to the witness stand. Corvus flew to the top of the wooden railing separating the public, observing from above with his black, penetrating eyes. The bailiff swore him in, and Elias sat down, his expression serene, almost unperturbed. Mr. Thorne, Hayes began, his voice laden with thinly veiled skepticism, bordering on condescension, you presented us with a rather peculiar demonstration. Could you explain in detail how you trained Corvus to perform such a feat? Elias looked at Hayes, then at the jury, who observed him with a mix of curiosity and doubt. I didn't train Corvus in the conventional sense, prosecutor. Corvus isn't a dog that learns tricks. He's an intelligent being with a remarkable memory and keen observational skills. Ah, yes, intelligent, Hayes scoffed, gesturing dismissively with his hand. So you're saying Corvus understands the concept of a map, of a geographical location, and of a cabin's secret. He understands what he saw and where he saw it, Elias replied, unperturbed. His voice was calm, but laden with a silent conviction. He remembers the exact spot where he found what attracted him in the forest. The map is merely a visual representation that he can associate with his spatial memory. How did he associate with that visual representation? Hayes pressed, taking a step towards the witness stand. Didn't you place a red X on the map for him to touch? Isn't that a direct command, a suggestion, a form of conditioning? The X was a mark I used at home to practice interaction with the map, Elias explained patiently, maintaining eye contact with the prosecutor, to see if he could transfer his spatial memory to a two-dimensional representation. But the location he pointed to today, prosecutor, was not the X I drew for practice. It was the exact spot where he found the body, which happened to coincide with the X I marked for practice. He was not trained to touch an X, but to identify the location. So you are asserting that Corvus, of his own volition and understanding, chose that specific spot on the map without any influence from you? Hayes asked, raising his voice, trying to undermine Elias's credibility. Without you, perhaps unconsciously, guiding him with a glance, a gesture, an inflection in your voice. Objection, Your Honor, Sophia interjected, rising quickly. The prosecutor is speculating about Mr. Thorne's intent and an animal's capacity. Mr. Thorne has already explained the methodology. Sustained, Judge Vargas said, casting a warning glance at Hayes. Stick to the facts, prosecutor. Hayes huffed, visibly displeased, but took a step back. Very well, Mr. Thorne. During this training at home, did Corvus always point to the same spot? Or did he make mistakes? Did he point to other places? In the beginning, like any learning process, there were trials and errors, Elias admitted. But Corvus is very observant. He quickly learned to associate the map image with his memory of the location. And yes, in recent weeks, he has always pointed to the same spot with precision. And what did you do to reward him when he got it right? Hayes asked, with a scoffing tone that did not go unnoticed by the jury. A treat, praise, doesn't that reinforce the desired behavior, making it a trick and not a truth? Elias smiled slightly, a glint in his eyes. Corvus is rewarded with attention and, yes, sometimes a piece of nut. But his main motivation, prosecutor, isn't the treat. It's the interaction, the resolution of a problem. Ravens are curious and intelligent creatures. They enjoy challenges. Hayes shook his head, visibly frustrated at not being able to break Elias's calm. So you expect this jury to believe that a raven, an animal, has the cognitive ability to solve a problem in a courtroom, identifying a location on a map, and that this should be considered valid evidence. I expect the jury to consider the facts, prosecutor, Elias replied, his voice calm and firm, echoing in the silence of the courtroom. The fact that Corvus was the original discoverer, the fact that he precisely pointed to the location, and the fact that the intelligence of ravens is widely documented by science. I am not asking you to believe in magic, but in observation and the ability of a living being to remember and identify. Sophia felt a shiver. Elias had been brilliant. He didn't defend himself, he explained. And he did so with a dignity that contrasted with Hayes's aggression. The jury seemed divided, some still skeptical, but others, Sophia noticed, were listening with renewed attention, perhaps even with a glimmer of admiration. Hayes, realizing he couldn't convincingly discredit Elias or Corvus, played one last card. Mr. Thorne, do you have any personal interest in the outcome of this trial? Are you friends with the defendant, Ilara? I did not know Ilara before this incident, Elias replied without hesitation. My only interest is that the truth be revealed, and that justice be done for the person buried in that shallow grave. Hayes sighed, defeated. No further questions, Your Honor. Sophia rose for redirect, but Judge Vargas was already striking her gavel. The court will take a brief recess. The jury is dismissed for lunch. We will return in 1 hour, and remember, do not discuss the case. As the jury rose, Sophia walked over to Elias, a smile of relief and gratitude on her face. You were incredible, Elias. Both of you were. Elias merely nodded, a glint of weariness in his eyes, as Corvus flew back to his shoulder, giving his ear a gentle nip, as if to say, good job. The truth had been presented in a way that defied all conventions. Now it was up to the jury to decide what to do with it. Ilara's fate and the very credibility of justice hung in the balance. The recess seemed to last an eternity. Sophia spent the minutes conversing in a low voice with Ilara, who remained impassive, her gaze distant, but with a slight tension in her shoulders that betrayed her anxiety. Elias, with Corvus perched on his shoulder, sat beside them, offering a comforting silence. When Judge Vargas returned, her demeanor was as austere as ever, but Sophia sensed a subtle shift in the air, a slight crack in the facade of unshakable impartiality. The murmur ceased instantly. Prosecutor Hayes, your closing arguments, the judge declared. Hayes stood up, his voice regaining confidence, though there was still a trace of irritation in his eyes. He tried to discredit Corvus's demonstration, in calling it a circus trick and a distraction from the concrete facts. He reiterated Ilara's presence at the cabin, her initial lack of cooperation, and the circumstantial evidence that the body was found on her property. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he concluded, his voice resonating, "do not be swayed by spectacles. The law is clear. A body was concealed. The defendant was there. Justice demands she be held accountable." Sophia felt a knot in her stomach, but stood up with new determination. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice clear and firm, "the prosecutor asks you to ignore what your own eyes saw today. He asks you to ignore the truth revealed by a living being who has no motive to lie or deceive. Corvus, the original discoverer, precisely pointed to the exact spot where the body was. This is not a trick. It is the memory of an extraordinary animal, which showed us that the discovery was a fortuitous event guided by instinct and intelligence and not by any knowledge or intent of concealment on my client's part." Looking at each member of the jury, the charge of concealment of a body requires the intent to hide. Where is the proof that Ilara intentionally hid the body? The only thing we know for sure is that Corvus found it. The truth, however unusual, is that the cabin's secret was uncovered in a way no one could have predicted. Reasonable doubt is not just a possibility here, it is a certainty. There is no proof that Ilara hid the body. There is only proof that it was found, and that the discovery was made by Corvus. I ask you to consider the totality of the evidence, and to allow the truth, however strange it may seem, to guide your decision. I ask you to find Ilara innocent." Judge Vargas instructed the jury with her usual precision, explaining the points of law and the necessity of proving intent for the concealment of a body. The jury retired, and the courtroom plunged into a tense silence. The following hours were the longest of Sophia's life. She watched Ilara, who seemed to have found a strange peace, or perhaps just resignation. Elias stroked Corvus, who dozed on his shoulder, oblivious to the gravity of the situation. Then, the notice. The jury had reached a verdict. Sophia's heart pounded. The room filled again, the anticipation palpable. Ilara clasped her hands, an almost imperceptible sign of nervousness. Elias held Sophia's hand, a silent gesture of support. The jury entered, their faces unreadable. The jury foreman handed the sealed envelope to the bailiff, who passed it to Judge Vargas. She read the contents, and for the first time, Sophia saw a clear emotion in her eyes. Surprise, perhaps even a glimmer of admiration. "Defendant Ilara," Judge Vargas said, her voice softer than Sophia had ever heard it, "please rise." Ilara stood, her posture erect, her gaze fixed on the judge. "In the case of the state versus Ilara, on the charge of concealment of a body," the judge continued, "the jury, by unanimous decision, found the defendant.